Now let's go ahead and create our interface. I'm just going to go to the app.js file. And the first thing I'm going to do is just going to run this application so we can have at least a browser showing us what we have. And you can see over here, it's just a React homepage or just a React dummy application. There we go. So what we want to do is I'll remove this part. I will remove all the header. There we go. And we want to create a button that will be increment button. And we want to create some sort of a label. All right. So in this case, I will start with a button and it will simply say increment. Okay. So we got the button and we can also go ahead and create a label or a heading. Let's say 0. That's the number. Okay. Now, once we have that, we need to make sure that all of our components that we have in our React application, they know about the store. And usually we do that inside index.js using the provider component. The provider component is part of the React Redux, so we need to install that. So let me go ahead and install that. npm install React Redux. Okay, there we go. Great. And now I can go ahead and run the application again, which is going to refresh the same page again. I mean, we haven't really changed anything. Let's go ahead and import something. So import provider from React Redux. There we go. And so that part does remain the same. We're going to use the provider. Now, one of the things that is mandatory when you're using a provider is the store. So we need to get the store. So let's go ahead and import store from, and I believe the store is from the index file. That's the default import. So we're just going to import that and then pass it over here as a store. There we go. Okay, so this means that at this point, the provider does have access to the store, because if you look over here in index, that's the default thing that we're exporting. Line number 30 actually shows you. When we press the increment button, nothing really happens. So how can we make that work? Well, there are a number of things that we need in this case. We need the counter actions, and we need to also import a couple of different things like a selector and also dispatches. So we can go ahead and import useSelector, and the selector is actually used to access the value from the global state, so that is mandatory. And useDispatch. useDispatch is actually used to dispatch the actions from React Redux. There we go. So we actually imported useSelector and useDispatch. So we imported two different things. We also need to import all the different actions. So import counter actions from, and then that will be store/index. And remember that the counter actions were actually exported, which is right here. Let's go back to our app.js. Okay, so it looks like we have everything over here. So once we press the increment button, the first thing we need to do is we need to see if the dispatch is going on or not. And the best way to check that is to look into our Redux tools. So let's go ahead and pull up our Redux tools, if we can access that somehow. I don't know why this is so big. Let's see. Okay. So it should be over here, Redux. You can already see the Redux is actually initialized. Our global state is initialized. We didn't have to include any weird lines from the Redux DevTools. The state is actually initialized, which is great. Okay. Let's expand it a little bit more so we can see all the actions. So if I press on the increment button right now, we can see that there is nothing going on over here. So this means that there are no actions getting dispatched. So that is something that we need to fix. So on click, and now we can actually make it a little bit bigger. On click, we will fire a function, and we are using this approach because we want to call a dispatch. So we'll call a dispatch, but we don't have access to the dispatch. Okay, so we will go inside our app component and we'll say dispatch equals to useDispatch. It is as easy as that. Now we can say dispatch, and what do we want to dispatch? Well, we want to dispatch an action. And where do we get the actions? Well, in the counter actions. So counter actions dot increment. Great. So this means that when you click on a button, it's going to dispatch an action, and that action is going to be the increment action. The best way to check is to just refresh your page and click on the increment button. And there we go. We can actually see the dispatch going on. And it is the counter/increment. So this dispatch is basically being dispatched. If you look at the state, you can see that state is also updating. But this value is not being transferred on to our interface. So how do we do that? Well, the useSelector hook is used to select the value from the global state, and that is something we can use. So we can say counter equals to useSelector, and when you use useSelector, you can get access to the global state, and you can simply return the value or the slice that you want. So state dot, and it will be simply called counter. That's what we want. All right. Once we have that, well, now it becomes much simpler. We can simply go ahead and say counter, and that's it. And now everything is working fine. Pretty simple. We didn't have to do map state to props, map dispatch to props, wrapping up the app with a connect. You can already see the code is much more compact. If you want to perform the decrement action, we can simply say counter actions dot decrement. So we're going to change that to decrement, and we will change this label to decrement also. And that is pretty much it. That's all you need to do. What about the increase action? So this is going to be a little bit different, because in the increase action, if I go over here in the actions, I'll go, or sorry, it's called the add action, right? So add, I can go ahead and pass in something. Now, whatever you pass over here, I'm passing 100, but you can pass anything you want. Let's say, let's pass 10 actually. So add plus 10. So whatever you pass over here in the add function, in the add action, is going to go right to this one. And that value that you passed in, you can access that value inside an automatically created variable or a property called payload. And yes, it has to be called payload. So this means that if I go back to my code and instead of this, I pass in an object with, let's say, whatever, value 10, you can do that. But then what will be the payload? What will be the value of the payload? This particular object. All right, so easy to remember, whatever you pass over here, that will become the actual payload. And let's go ahead and add 10, and there we go. We can add 10, we can increment, we can decrement. So you can already see that it is much more simpler now. A lot of code, the boiler code that we used to write some time back, we don't have to do that anymore. All right. So hopefully you have enjoyed this. The next lectures we'll be looking into that how we can add multiple slices and how we can divide this index.js file into different files.